My whole family has been mentally disturbed for a year. Both should be sentenced to death. Just let those words sink in. These are the words of a mother, Renu Devi, and she is demanding the ultimate punishment for the people who killed her son. It's a plea that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today, a story that isn't just about a horrifying crime, but about a country's struggle with the very idea of justice. So, we're going to break down the absolutely shocking Meerut Blue Drum murder. We'll get into the details of the crime, and then we're going to connect it all to one of the most complex and debated legal ideas in the Indian judicial system, something called the rarest of the rare doctrine. All right, before we get into the law, we have to talk about the crime itself. And I'll tell you, this is a case that was so grim, it grabbed the entire nation's attention and just sparked this massive outrage. So, this whole tragic story really revolves around three key people. First, you have the victim, Saurabh Rajput. He was an officer in the Merchant Navy. Then you have the two people accused of his murder, his own wife, Muskan Rastogi, and her lover, Saihar Shukla. So, the big question is, why? What was the motive here? Well, according to the prosecutors, it's a story that's unfortunately all too familiar. Muskan and Zahil were having an affair, and they allegedly decided that the only way to be together was to get rid of the one person standing in their way, and that was Saurabh. And when you look at the timeline, you really start to see just how planned out this whole thing was. It's chilling. So, on March 3rd, 2025, Saurabh was allegedly drugged and then murdered. But it didn't stop there. After he was dead, his body was dismembered and then sealed inside a blue drum filled with cement. The two suspects, they took off, fled to Himachal, but the police caught up with them pretty quickly, between March 17th and 19th. Okay, so the suspects are caught. Now the investigation shifts from a manhunt to a full-blown legal battle. So let's look at how the prosecution actually started to put their case together. And the case they built? Wow, it was immense. We're talking about a charge sheet that was nearly 1,000 pages long. Just imagine that. Every little detail, all the evidence against Muskan and Sahil, all laid out. So let's break down the legal blueprint here. They're facing 4 really serious charges under the Indian Penal Code. You've got Section 302, that's the main one, for murder. Then there's 120B, which is for criminal conspiracy. Basically, the law says they planned this together. Next up is Section 201 for destroying evidence, and yeah, that covers the dismemberment and hiding the body in that blue drum. And finally, you have Section 34 for common intention. This one's important. It means that even if only one of them did the physical act, the law sees them as equally guilty because they share the same goal. Now, to build this case, the prosecution brought in 34 witnesses. But get this, in a really stunning twist, among those witnesses were Muskan's own parents. Can you imagine? They actually gave statements against their own daughter, holding her responsible for what happened. So with all this brutality, all this evidence laid bare, you can imagine the reaction from the public and the family. It was fast, it was loud, and their demand was crystal clear. They wanted the death penalty. And Saurabh's mother, her words really cut through it all. She said, if these two are not punished, it will embolden others. And that right there, that frames this whole call for the death penalty. It's not just about revenge for her, it's about sending a message, about deterring anyone else from ever doing something like this again. So you've got this intense public outrage, a family in just unbelievable pain, and all this pressure building up. But here's the thing. In the Indian legal system, getting a death sentence isn't simple. It's not a straightforward process, no matter how horrible the crime is. And that brings us to the real core of what we need to understand here. And that core idea, that legal principle that stands between a murder conviction and the death penalty, is something called the rarest of the rare doctrine. So what exactly is that? Well, this whole doctrine came out of a landmark Supreme Court case back in 1980, Bachchan Singh versus the state of Punjab. And what it did essentially was set an incredibly high bar. The court ruled that the death penalty, capital punishment, should only be for the absolute worst of the worst cases. We're talking the most extreme, the most exceptional, the most heinous crimes you can even imagine. And here's the core philosophy behind it. It's really a tale of two punishments. For murder, life imprisonment is the rule. That's the default sentence. The death penalty, that's the exception. For a court to even consider it, they have to be convinced that sending someone to prison for life is, and this is the exact legal phrase, unquestionably foreclosed as an option. Basically, there's no other choice. So, you might be wondering, how on earth does a court make that kind of call? Well, it's a really complex balancing act. They have to weigh what are called aggravating factors. Things like the sheer brutality of the crime, or the fact that it was so cold blooded and pre planned. But they have to balance that against mitigating factors, things like the offender's background, or whether there's any chance they could ever be reformed. It's absolutely not a simple checklist. It's a very difficult judgment call.
All right, so let's bring it all back to this case. We've seen the horrific facts, and now we understand this incredibly high legal standard. So, how do the two stack up against each other?
And that's exactly where this trial is right now. The judge has to take all those gruesome details, the betrayal by a spouse, the dismemberment, hiding the body in a cement drum, and weigh them against the very strict rules of the rarest of rare doctrine. You can bet the prosecution is arguing that this case is the very definition of what that doctrine was made for. And on the other side, the defense is going to argue that, as terrible as it is, it just doesn't meet that incredibly high legal bar.
And it looks like a decision could be coming pretty soon. The trial is now in its final stages. The court has already put 32 questions to both Muskin and Sahil about all the charges against them. So what's next? Well, we're looking at final arguments, and then the verdict and the sentence.
And so this case leaves us with a really heavy question. When a crime is so brutal that it shocks an entire nation, when a family is crying out for what they see as justice, how does a legal system balance that raw human emotion with a rule that's designed to be used only in the most extreme circumstances? In the end, what is the true meaning of justice?